Good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, demographic decline has arrived in the Middle East, and this process is challenging long-held assumptions about the region's resilience to global fertility trends. The Middle East was once thought to be immune or less susceptible to demographic decline due to cultural and religious norms. Now, countries like Iran and Tunisia are experiencing sub-replacement birth rates. As populations shrink and age, economic and geopolitical consequences loom, is it merely a phase or a permanent transformation? How will societies adapt, and what are the implications for the region's future stability? Joining us to discuss all of this is Nicholas Eberstadt, who holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He has authored numerous works, including Men Without Work, Post-Pandemic Edition, and more recently, Lessons for an Unserious Superpower. Mr. Eberstadt will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Nicholas Eberstadt. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've put together a little slide deck because I think we can convey much more information with pictures than just using words, and I promise this will not be death by PowerPoint. Let's go back to the beginning of the slide deck if we can, all the way back at the start. Yeah, okay, so I'll try to give an overview and talk about a few dynamics, and then a couple of topics, problems, pressure points that seem to be emerging with changing demographics in the greater Middle East. So next slide, please. This one's a little bit out of date because demographers are always looking in the rearview window for census results. But the Pew Research Center did a fine piece of work a few years ago trying to estimate the total global population of believers in Islam, the Ummah. Back then, their estimate was about 1.6 billion worldwide, circa 2010. They'll be waiting for the 2020 round of census returns to come in, which will be more or less, any time now, and they'll have an updated estimate for the year 2000. Looks like about 2 billion people worldwide at this point. You can see the story hasn't changed all that much in terms of local concentrations of populations or where the top 10 countries might be in the world. Next one, please. The remarkable change that has swept through the Ummah is the same remarkable change that has swept through the populations of the rest of the world over the last 40 years. And this is a huge plunge in fertility. What I show here is the total fertility rates, births per woman per lifetime, estimated for around 1980 versus those same rates for Muslim majority countries in 2020 or thereabouts. Now, if there had been no change at all, every country here would be on that same 45-degree line. But you see there has been a vast drop for many of the Muslim majority countries in the world over the past 40 years. Let's go to the next one, please. This gives you a sense of how dramatic the drop in fertility has been for certain countries in the world. I'm looking at the biggest absolute drops in a 20-year period, births per woman per lifetime. 9 of the 10 biggest drops in a 20-year period in terms of number of babies per woman per lifetime have been in Muslim majority countries. And this is really striking because the only Muslim majority place on this chart is Singapore. Unlike Singapore or the East Asian tigers, we haven't seen the same sort of dramatic socioeconomic modernization in most of the Ummah that we see in East Asia. So something else is driving this big change in birth rates. Let's look at the next one, please. Again, that red line is about the replacement level, the number of babies per lifetime a woman needs to have for population stability to continue. And these are all Muslim majority countries, only Muslim majority countries. Turkey and Iran are below replacement. Number of countries in the Middle East are below replacement, including Tunisia and Lebanon, and we're about to see Morocco and maybe even Algeria go below replacement as well. Next slide, please. The real determinants of fertility decline are intensely debated by social sciences. I think that this slide gives a kind of a hint. The closest correlation between the best predictor of different fertility levels in the world across countries and within countries over time is how many children women say they want, desired family size. It's kind of reassuring because it means we're not rabbits or robots, but of course it begs the question of what is changing desired family size, because there's obviously been a huge revolution in desired family size in the Middle East already. So the next one, please. Interestingly enough, I'm not going to give you the whirlies with econometrics, but interestingly enough, this chart shows that if you take income and literacy and contraceptive use into account, Muslim countries actually have lower levels of births and fertility than non-Muslim countries at any given level of education or income or contraception. It's actually a little lower. Next one, please. And this next chart suggests that in relation to any given level of usage of modern contraception, Muslim majority societies actually have lower fertility. That's because, of course, people don't believe that babies are born, come out from under cabbages. They don't use modern contraception. They use other means of contraception to limit family size. Next slide, please. We're seeing a huge flight from marriage in Arabic-speaking countries. And this is kind of one way of showing this chart. The next one will show that as well. This was for women. Let's look at the next one, which is for men as well. And let's look at the next one, which puts the flight from marriage in Muslim majority countries in the context of rich countries a little bit earlier. Let's look at the next one. This work of modern art is intended to show that at any given level of never married population, female population, Arabic countries get there at half the income level that rich societies did. So there's something going on that's not just in income and development. Next one, please. I think that our little friend here, the iPhone, may have something revolutionary to do with some of the changes in fertility trends we're seeing around the world. I can't prove it, but I suspect it. You can see what's happening with the proliferation of internet usage here. And next one, please. and cell phone, smartphone usage, also radically saturating many of these societies. Next one, please. And so here are the ethnicities of the greater Middle East laid out in a map. Next one, please. Strangely enough, it is impossible to get demographic numbers on one of the biggest uh, significant ethnic groups in the Middle East, which is Kurdish population. They're distributed largely in 4 countries that apparently seem to have no interest in enumerating them as Kurds. Next slide, please. But you can see there are very big differences in fertility within Turkey, for example. And if you look at that map, you can probably guess where the Kurdish concentrations are in the population. Next slide, please. I did some estimates trying to project the Kurdish speaking or the ethnically Kurdish population in Turkey into the future on the basis of some adventures that I had over there a while ago. Next slide, please. Long story short, because the birth levels are so much higher for the Kurdish ethnicity than for the Turkish ethnicity being far below replacement at this point, we're likely to see a big change in proportions of ethnic population within the country of Turkey over the years immediately ahead. Next one, please. And of course, then there's Iran, which is on the whole below replacement now. Tehran's birth level is about the same as Zurich's at this point. Long, prolonged subreplacement fertility leads to population decline eventually, unless there's compensating immigration. Next slide, please. Here are some projections, some estimates for the past and projections for the future for the 15 to 25 group in Iran. You can see there was a huge increase in total numbers and in the proportion out of total population of 15 to 24s in Iran. That's what you might call a youth bulge, kind of peaked around the time of, say, 2008, 2009, if those years mean anything in recent Iranian history to you, and now declining. Next slide, please. Also, it looks as if the 18-year-old male population has peaked, is dropping, may bounce again as an echo, but will drop below, is on track to drop below the totals in some of the neighboring countries, including Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq. What does that mean for calculations about security in the region for Iran? Next slide, please. Well, we know who said that there was a demographic bomb in the Holy Lands. That was the departed Yasser Arafat. And for a fair period of time, it looked as if the Palestinian population might outbaby the Israelis. But that prospect, I think, has come and gone. Let's look at the next one, please. That's because the immensely high fertility level for the Palestinians in the Holy Lands has been under steady decline, where the Israeli Jewish fertility level has actually been rising over the last generation. Next slide, please. And this means that the crossover between the population total for West Bank and Gaza and the population total for Israel doesn't look like it's going to happen any time in the foreseeable future. There was a long period when this was expected by demographers to be an almost predictable event, no longer. A final bit of information. Next one, please. With prolonged subreplacement fertility, we're on the track to see the working age populations of a number of places in the Middle East peak in the 2030s, just as young working age population in the United States may do. Next slide, please. And we're going to see pronounced graying of populations throughout the greater Middle East, because that's what happens with prolonged subreplacement fertility. And you can see I've highlighted countries that are projected to have median age of 40 or older, where half or more of the population is over the age of 40 by the year 2040, which is not that far in the future. What's that going to mean for the Middle East? Well, let me show you the final slide. What I think this hasn't come through quite as clearly as I would have wanted, but let me read to the blind on this one. The upshot is that countries with much lower income levels than the United States, with radically lower income levels than the United States, are going to be about as gray in the future as the United States will be, or perhaps grayer. So the youth bulge is going to mutate into a senior bulge, into a gray wave. And the whole question of how to pay for the chronic diseases of graying populations and for a kind of an eventual senior tsunami on much smaller pocketbooks than the graying countries of Europe or the graying state of the USA will have at their disposal is going to be a real question throughout the greater Middle East. So thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take it from here.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Nicholas. I will start with a question from Mr. Daniel Pipes, who says, "Thank you so much for joining us, Nick, and for the excellent analysis. Your thoughts on the role of Islam in these developments, please?"
Dr. Pipes, always asking the easy questions. What I can say by analogy, and I certainly am not a specialist on Islam, much less the greater Middle East, is that in Europe, in North America, Australia, and other OECD countries, we associate the big declines in fertility with the spread of secular thinking, with the retreat of religion. And we still see a very strong correspondence between high fertility among people who say that religion and worship matters in their lives, and lower fertility among those who say that they don't. This makes me wonder if we aren't also seeing a retreat in belief in Islam, described by some as a common Abrahamic faith to Judeo-Christianity. I think in particular of a place like Iran, where we've seen subreplacement fertility for more than a generation now, where, as I mentioned, we see a birth level of maybe 1.4 births per woman per life in a city like Tehran. There are hints, of course, to an untrained newspaper reader like me, that there is a retreat of religion in Iran when I see the complaints in the Iranian media about the closing of so many mosques because of a lack of demand. It makes me wonder how much of a secular wave has swept through the greater Middle East along with this big decline in fertility. But you all are the specialists.
Thank you very much. Now, to sort of follow up, we have a question from Andrew Rosemarine. He's an international lawyer based in the UK, and he asks, whenever Islam has real influence, there tends to be a population boom. Do you agree with this?
I think what we would say in the past is that in the greater Middle East, and of course, if we're going to extend the Ummah to India, parts of India, to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, parts of the Philippines, we may see different sorts of stories there because um, there were there had been a there was a commonly high level of fertility in all of those countries in the early post-war era, but we'd also have said the same about Brazil, about Mexico. Um, Mainly the reason for the population boom wasn't the high level of fertility, because that is kind of a perennial. The population boom was mainly caused by improvements in health, by declines in mortality. It wasn't that people suddenly started breeding like rabbits, it was that they finally stopped dying like flies. And I think we can attribute most of the in most of the greater Middle East, we can attribute most of the population boom to improvements in health rather than changes in fertility.
All right, thank you. Now, I understand the topic of discussion here is about the shifting and declining population inside of the Middle East. But if you contrast that with Europe, where migrants from Muslim countries are emigrating to Europe, and then their population is booming and basically outpacing that of Europeans. Can you comment on that discrepancy?
Sure. Um, it's not as easy to follow the demographic patterns or profiles of Muslims in Europe as you might think when you consider how data-rich developed countries are. There are a lot of places, including the United States, where enumerators aren't allowed to ask people about their religions. So Congress has made it proscribed for almost 50 years for the Census Bureau to ask any questions about what faith people adhere to. So it's a mixed bag. Some countries in Europe are that way, some countries are not. My impression is that we have a very mixed bag in looking uh, at the demographic profiles of people who come from Muslim majority countries, people who are Muslims themselves, moved to Europe. Um, it's very particular upon the sending country and the receiving country. I myself would argue that a big lasting discrepancy between an immigrant population's fertility and the host country's fertility is a kind of a demographic hint that assimilation is not underway. On the one hand, if you look at the Netherlands and the big inflow from Indonesia, the immigrants and their children from Indonesia in Holland have, you know, slightly lower level of fertility than the native Dutch. It's indistinguishable, really. If, on the other hand, you go to Belgium and look at Moroccans, it's about twice as high as the local Belgian native-born population. That doesn't look like assimilation to me. If you go to the UK, when I looked at these figures a little while ago, here's a mystery. Uh, they do give figures for UK by religion and by country of origin. Uh, Muslims born in India have a slightly lower fertility level than native-born Brits. Muslims born in Bangladesh have a very slightly higher fertility level than native-born Brits. Um, Muslims born in Pakistan are about twice as high as native-born Brits. So, quick, which is the group that's not assimilating as well as the others? I have a guess there. Um, we have to talk about France. Um, the French government, for reasons of its own, holds data on fertility of immigrants and fertility by religion on about as tight a hold as the Soviet Union used to hold its military budget. It's almost impossible for outsiders to crack, and it's also almost impossible for French demographers to crack. That may give you a hint that this is a tiny, sensitive bit of an issue in France. Uh, there is one survey called the Gender and Generations Survey, done internationally, which also includes France. To go by those numbers, the people who identify themselves as Muslim in France appear to have about a 50% higher birth level than others within France. So that does not look to me like by my metrics, as a population that has entirely assimilated locally.
Thank you. Now, moving on here, David Levine would like to ask, can you comment on the availability and legality of abortion and contraception in Muslim countries?
Well, there's been a big push in the picture, of course, is different depending upon which parts of the Ummah one is in. There have been longstanding family planning programs, state-sponsored family planning programs in Bangladesh and in Indonesia. So that would suggest that contraceptions is available and actually being promoted by the state. Likewise, in Iran, um, generally speaking, there's been a loosening of the strictures against modern contraception. The question about abortion is a little bit more difficult to answer since there's always abortion everywhere. It's just a question of how legal it is, uh, how sanctioned it is by state authorities.
Thank you. Now, I believe we have unfortunately run out of time and come to the end of our podcast here, but I want to take the time to thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights, Nicholas.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure here. Now, before we sign off, is there somewhere where we can direct our audience if they'd like to follow more of your work?
Yes, I'm a researcher at the American Enterprise Institute, which is aei.org. And if you go to our institute's website, you'll see that there are scholars pages. I have a Nicholas Eberstadt website there with my homework on it, which includes work on obviously the Greater Middle East, but also on other questions.
All right, very good. And for those of you watching in the future on YouTube, I will be sure to link that page in the description below. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please be sure to join us on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. And we would also like to take this time to invite you all to our annual policy conference in Washington, D.C., taking place the week of May 19th. For more information and to register, you can go on to our website at meforum.org/policyconference 2025, all one word, and all of the details and registration info can be found there. As always, we thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.